Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our today's webinar, Safeguarding Your Sensitive Data with Microsoft Purview, and also featuring our special guest today, Drew Madelung. So my name is Sylvia. I'm a sales executive here at SysKit, and as said, today we're going to be joined by our special star, Drew, and my colleague Bruno, who will be showing you a demo of SysKit Point Solution, well, a bit later on in the demo. So many of you already know us as a SysKit, as a company, but for those who still don't, let me give you a quick introduction. So SysKit is a software development company. We've been on the market for more than 13 years now. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance and security, as well as products for SharePoint on-premise administration. We currently have more than 3,000 customers all across the globe, and they're ranging from, SMBs, small businesses, up to large corporations with, a couple of hundreds of thousands users in their environment. So yeah, we currently offer 4 products, including the award-winning Gatsby Docket, which I believe a lot of you know for SharePoint on-premise documentation administration, as well as the SysKit Point for Microsoft 365 governance that, as mentioned, we'll be demoing a bit later on today. Okay, so just before we start with the webinar, let's go through a few housekeeping items here. So all registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within the, few days after it's done. After Drew's presentation, we'll have a short demo of SysKit Point platform where we'll be showing you how the platform can actually work in collaboration with the peer review, how it can help you protect sensitive data, how it can review internal and external user activities, and continuously just prevent data oversharing and potential breaches. After that part, we're going to have a Q&A session where Drew is going to be answering all of the questions that you may have for him, and I hope you're going to have a lot. And yeah, please just use this native Q&A function you're going to find to the right side of your screen to, ask any questions throughout the webinar whenever you feel like it. Okay, now let me do a quick introduction on our star today, our special guest, Drew. So Drew Madelung is a cloud solutions architect and a Microsoft MVP for Office apps and services. He's experienced in a range of technologies and specializes in collaboration and teamwork workspaces such as Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive. Drew also helped deploy Microsoft 365 to a ton of global companies while also rolling out modern information protection and information governance technologies. And he's also been a Microsoft consultant for the past, 10 plus years. He speaks at the many Microsoft 365 industry events and conferences. So yeah, he's a big star in M365 environment, to put it that way. So now I will give a warm welcome to him and turn things over. Drew, are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Sylvia.
Great.
So thank you, everyone, for coming in to talk a little bit about Microsoft Purview today with our friends over at SysKit here. And I want to start off with first introducing a little bit more about myself. So I have been consulting for a long time. If you need to get a hold of me, this is my contact information. Feel free before or after. I do reply quite frequently to things like this. Outside of this buff I'm speaking at, I'm a pretty large golfer, and my life's kind of changed around as I have 2 little girls at home. It's kind of nice to be home doing these things versus in a lot of in-person scenarios. So, but in general, my role, I help organizations deploy M365, and I've been doing it in a lot of regulated industries over the last 4+ years, a lot of financial services, healthcare, some government, some public utility. So really it kind of transformed into the space of how can you move forward with protecting data, and how do you move forward with moving into M365 while also protecting the sensitive data that you have. And that kind of led me deeper into the Purview realm and deeper into how we are going to, or why we need to safeguard that data. So whether it's from a compliance or regulatory standpoint, into what is Microsoft Purview, right? So I've been deploying M365. Purview is a fairly new name in the market. What does that actually mean? So I've kind of taken what I've done in helping organizations deploy these solutions. I brought it into here. So to talk with you about why safeguard it, what is Purview, and then how does it actually safeguard your data and how do you get started? So what are the actual tools that you use? What are some of the scenarios and challenges that you most likely have in your organization, which is why you're here listening to this conversation. So I want to hopefully take this, or hopefully help you figure out what is this and what can you do with it. And that's been a lot of this kind of stemmed from helping those companies move and figuring out. Honestly, people get a lot of what is Purview, and I want to start higher. Right? I want to start with what is kind of evolving with this, and why. What have I seen this become more important? And a lot of it is about, think about a lot of things about data and the user. So I'm going to kind of take this from two angles of the data that you have in your organization and the way that your users work with that data in your organization. And think of those as kind of pillars as you move into safeguarding your data. So it's not just about the data, but data is exploding. If you look at any of the metrics, if you look at the numbers that you'll hear at like the M365 conference, like just the amount of petabytes of information per day, it's incredibly high. And when you think of that in an organization, it's not just like Word documents out there too. It's like how that content has to work across different platforms. It has to work on your phone, it has to work in an unstructured environment out into another file share. It might have to be uploaded into another third-party solution. And that adds risk, right? If you don't have a way to know what is sensitive or what needs to be safeguarded, and data keeps exploding, the longer you wait, the more challenging it's going to be to try to identify and safeguard your sensitive data. Because not all data is sensitive. But you need to think about this. Do you have a strategy for protecting and managing your critical data? So a lot of times when I start with organizations, is what is critical to you? And it's a lot of chicken and the egg of what can I protect versus what do I need to, or like what can Microsoft Purview do to protect sensitive data versus a lot of questions I return is what's sensitive to you. So as an example, I recently helped work with an R&D company, and they have nothing to do with like your social security. I mean, that's your standard socials and credits and credit card numbers. But what's sensitive to them? What is the patent information? What are the things that the recipes that if they got out would be incredibly detrimental to them as an organization? Think of this as your special sauce or your crown jewels. And you want to start there, right? What do you have for a strategy for identifying that? And then you can really start to think of where is that data moving? What controls do you have inside and outside of your organization, right? A lot of times you'll think of safeguarding as just external movement of data. But when you go down that zero trust, it's all about least privileged. And when you think about insider risk, a lot of that is dealing with content moving around internally to people that don't have the right, that shouldn't be having access to it. So you have internal, external controls for your sensitive data. And then when you have this, how are you actually identifying it, right? How are you protecting it? Am I doing something on that piece of content that if it did get exposed, right, or if I do need to work securely with a vendor or with a partner, how can I ensure that only that partner can read it? And these are the strategies you need to think about as you're starting to move into your Purview deployment or move into safeguarding your data. But it is really hard. This is not a short-term solution. This is not a like we can do it in a week. You have this idea that there is so much data that the majority of organizations, 80% of organizations, don't have confidence that they're actually doing it anymore today. So when you get into this, a lot of this is get started with something and continue, and it can always continue to refine. This is a program. This is an operational process. This isn't a one-time thing. Because as data moves, data changes, a file might not have sensitive data today, tomorrow it might have it, and then the next day it might not. So how do you become more adaptive into the ever-changing state of data as it's going around? And a lot of this is what's considered dark data. So a lot of organizations I work with, they say we might have a classification policy, but we haven't classified anything. Or maybe we've tried to deploy classifications, but it doesn't actually work the way we want. Or we have these file shares that have not been scanned ever. How do we know what's actually out there for sensitive data? So this concept of dark data leads to the challenges that you need to think about of how you can deliver them, or how you can solve them. And when you were looking at this, it's not just the sensitive data, it's not just the aspect of the dark data and the risk of breach. It's also regulatory controls for data management. So when I say that, it could be you're almost diving into your retention or what type of business processes are allowed to move data between boundaries. Those are especially when you start to bring in external vendors, those regulatory controls can lead to very specific fines or very specific controls that you might not be meeting from an audit standpoint. So by having this data exploding, by having this data by having the amount of data risk kind of lead to these challenges, you have also these very specific data security risks. So you have this kind of broad stroke of, we don't know where our sensitive data is. We have a lot of sensitive data. Now, what's happening with that sensitive data? So you have data breaches, right? So a data breach can be as simple as data being emailed out externally, or it could be socially engineered to have that data be sent out, or it could be an account be breached and actually have a physical breach of an account in your environment and then accessing sensitive data. It's the odds of it happening inside your organization, you might not know about it, it might already have, but it most likely will, right? Like it's just, we want to try to prevent it, but the numbers are showing that organizations are leading to it. The odds are that it will happen. How do you try to keep that risk as low as possible? And then, as I mentioned before, it's not just data leaving, it's the insider movement of that data too. So that malicious behavior, potentially me trying to take this data and do something with it internally. And that also is accounting for a large amount of breaches of cost incurred for your organization. And when you have all this data movement and you have this, let's say, risk of data moving internally or data moving externally, what has really changed a lot is the fragmented solutions that we're working with. So whether you're working with multiple third-party solutions for data protection, or you're working with multiple third-party solutions for collaboration and communication, you could be in. I have plenty of organizations that are in a combination of Slack and Teams and Box and 365 all at the same time, not counting the shadow IT data of people moving data in and out. You're gonna struggle with that because you might have all these separate solutions. That how am I going to do classification in Box? How am I going to do classification out in Google if I'm required to do that? And then how do I protect that data in those other cloud locations? So what we need to do with this information is protect the data where it lives through its life cycle. So when you think about it, some keywords there are life cycle in that statement. That data is going to evolve. Data is going to like you think your standard life cycle of a piece of content, it's created out in OneDrive. When I create that data in OneDrive, it might not have sensitive data there. I then go move it to a SharePoint site. I might email it to a partner. And then I might upload it to a shared location. And then at some point, it might have sensitive data into it. How do we know when that happens? And then once it's done, let's say once that file, how do we remove access for that after a period of time and then retain that content when it's done? So that sensitive data, you can also forget about it if you're not following it from retention. So think about wherever it lives throughout its life cycle. It's not I've fixed this because I've set up DLP in OneDrive. If that's not like solving it. You need to think about it wherever it goes. And then when you think about the data, you need to understand the user activity. So let's say for an example, I worked with an organization where we needed, as part of their business process, they were in the financial industry, they needed to send sensitive, for very specific reasons, they needed to have OneDrive be available to send externally with sensitive data. That's a user activity. But then how do we limit the risk of, say, like the quantity, or what if that user is then having a specific activity like occurring frequently, like they're starting to send more sensitive data externally, or maybe they put in their 2 weeks and then they send a ton of external data. What is the user activity that's happening in the context based on that sensitive data, right? So don't if you don't know what's sensitive, and if a user is sending something out, how do you know what's the important level of that? So you have to have this idea of sensitivity, protection, and the user activity helps inform what's happening with that. So you need to understand how people would be interacting with that sensitive data. And then when you understand that, you can start to put the controls in for what is unallowed, where it is allowed, and how do we protect that. So it can be, I want to work on a corporate device. Maybe if I'm on a non-corporate device, I want to be able to work on specific SharePoint sites that are open, like our intranet. But maybe if a piece of sensitive content gets uploaded to a SharePoint site or Microsoft Team, I want that site to be blocked down or enforce MFA. But again, that comes back to the type of sensitive data. So you kind of bring in these pillars, you use this to start to minimize risk, right? So when you're thinking about safeguarding your data, it's almost I've also seen organizations get stuck by paralysis by analysis. I want to protect everything. I need to make sure every single thing is done and every piece of sensitive data is always blocked. That's very hard to attain. So you need to think about how you minimize the risk. And some of the key risks we're seeing is, think if you're working with your customers, what if you do have an issue that occurs? So how do you minimize that from a news standpoint, right? You don't want to be the one in the news. You don't want to be the one that goes out and on a news website and says this happened because of this person, because of this organization. Now they have these fines, right? So these are risks that you have to try to meet based on the sensitive data that you have and based on the challenges you have that it's going to kind of happen. So what can we do about that, right? What specifically can we do about that? And that's really where Microsoft Purview starts to come into play. So what Microsoft Purview is a collection of solutions, right? So it's a brand of solutions, and it brings together the risk and compliance and data governance solutions into a product. So it's bringing our DLP, it's bringing our information protection, it's bringing our audit controls and our data cataloging into a single umbrella. And what this does is it allows more seamless integration between these products together. That is primarily what Microsoft Purview is. Microsoft Purview is a brand. Now, Microsoft Purview, like I said, is core, kind of behind the scenes. It is a branding simplification. Now, there was a product called Azure Purview. So Azure Purview was your structured, your schematized assets, your Azure SQL data, that, and how would I catalog that and put insights around that? That was Azure Purview. Now, they've taken that brand and they've expanded that. So Microsoft Purview is not just Azure Purview, but a combination of Azure Purview and the compliance suite. So if you look on the left, you see the collection of what the names were prior to the Microsoft Purview branding simplification. And on the right, what you'll see is a more standardized approach. So you have Microsoft Purview and then whichever the product is behind it. Now, so on it at its highest level when Purview was released, there's not a technical change that occurred. Right? There wasn't something that said now that it's called Purview, it's going to do something different. But what's happening is with the change to Purview, is we now have an integrated suite. We have how did these solutions work together? Because what we would see out of organizations like, I want to go deploy communication compliance. And I'd be like, well, it'd be really good to understand the user activity inside of your environment to know like who needs to fall into this and what type of data they're communicating, which really leads you into information protection and data loss prevention. And then they might say, well, I also want to go back and audit all my data that's out there. It's like, well, what data are you actually looking to audit, right? What am I trying to find? So you kind of had this story of how would I use these products together when they looked like disparate products. So now they have unified into a comprehensive solution really built around our data. So it's 3 pillars kind of around understanding and governing. So the visibility, right? How do I find my data? And then safeguarding where it lives. And that's where I'm going to concentrate on the rest of this is kind of how do we safeguard that data where it lives across clouds, apps, and devices. So it's not just sitting on my Windows workstation. It's protecting that data across clouds. And Purview gives us the power to do that using some of these specific solutions. And then around the whole side of it, we have things like Compliance Manager to help understand our risk mitigation as part of this. So what do we need to actually be doing with this? And what's kind of what I would say the benefit of having deployed Purview versus one of the challenges we have, which is disparate systems, right? So a lot when we're looking at safeguarding your data, you have to think about the operations. What happens if someone does have a DLP incident? What happens if something does actually get breached? How do I know which solution I'm going to go be looking in to identify that breach? Like what type of hunting am I going to potentially have to do for, let's say, an XDR standpoint? What is this integrated into a SIM already, so I can actually go back and do some forensic reviews? Like by staying within the Purview suite, it integrates the operations around it and uses intelligence to inform those integrations. So instead of, let's say I have a third-party product for DLP, another for email-based DLP, a third-party product for encryption, which manages my encryption, let's say on mail send, and then let's say I have another endpoint solution doing vulnerability scanning on my endpoints for let's just say antivirus. Like, what if something happens? How do I know which tool to go back in and in a very timely fashion go find what happened? And that's where Purview can really help from safeguarding, which is integrated together. So when you dive into integration, there are three key solutions inside of the Purview stack, which we'll be using to safeguard your data. So we think about protecting sensitive data, managing insider risk, and preventing data loss. Those are our three key pillars for safeguarding data inside of Microsoft Purview. The first one is going to be through Microsoft Purview Information Protection. So this is one of the most common ones I'm seeing being deployed right now and working with organizations to do, which is do data classification and data protection based on the files, based on the content. So this actually can be, this is, you see the screenshot here, you'll have the ability to create content and classify that content. And then those classifications can lead to specific things. So it can be, I want to not allow a specific vendor or partner to be able to get access to this. I want to integrate that into DLP controls. I want to integrate that into knowledge that says based on specific types of information, maybe it's automatically going to be defined as confidential. And it's built directly into our tool. So it's called native labeling. So I can pull up Word, I can pull up PowerPoint, I can pull up Excel, I can pull up Outlook. It's built into our productivity tools today. You don't have to go out and have a third party to support this. And you can actually extend this information into other third-party cloud solutions. So I can go in and say, as data is moving in and out of a box, I want to identify, let's say if I don't want to upload anything that's highly confidential into Box. Great, Purview you can actually use to extend these classifications out to these third-party solutions. And one of the core things about this classification is it stays with the data, right? So I highlighted the data at the beginning. And what happens if the data, we still need to be able to share that data set securely. It's a very common scenario. That classification will stay with the email, it will stay with the file. So if I do upload it to a shared location, I could potentially put controls in place that say other people can't get to it after the fact. And maybe I want to offline that file after a period of time. So it's consistent. It's metadata as part of it that moves along with it as part of its life cycle. It's not just a stamp or a footer as part of it. Now, as you start to move into through data, you have users. So you have data risk that you can help with information protection. You have user risk, which helps identify the activity that's happening based on that sensitive data and the way that your users are working. So as you start to see things like user becomes more risky because they potentially have been put in their 2 weeks, so you have a leaver scenario. Now that leaver scenario, that person within the right before they put in their 2 weeks, let's say they offloaded or uploaded a bunch of content that wasn't deemed sensitive at that point, but since they put in this other trigger, that then would move into an alert. So kind of what is the user life cycle that's happening? Then how can we actually use pseudonymization to track that so it's not, you kind of have privacy with it. So I can say, this person did this, I'm the incident reporter, I can go triage this and actually manage the whole case in regards to whatever that person did. And now what's out now is what's called adaptive protection. So I can say, based on, let's say, that sensitive data, or based on the way that the user's working, I can become adaptive in my DLP policies. So I could say maybe on day one, a regular user tries to send one piece of content externally. My DLP policy out there is going to allow that to happen. But let's say they're starting to perform actions that are starting to deem themselves as risky. So their baseline or their threshold for their user is going to become a new level. So I can say maybe one user at user A can continue to do this, but user B is showing risky scenarios. We are going to enhance or adaptively update our DLP to protect that user account. And maybe user B then can have a DLP policy in place that's higher based on the risk of that user. So it integrates it together. And that, let's say, that risk of that moving out of that data can be identified based on the information protection or the classification of it. So it's a big happy circle that to get to DLP, if we really want to get to DLP, we need to understand what is sensitive, understand what the users are working with, and then we can build granular DLP policies to work across different workloads on Windows, on Mac, on your browser, on email. It's a very, in Teams, I'll show you a little bit of that. And you can leverage those insights to add DLP policies across your stack. And then on the end, it's all together at the end for how we review it, look at the incidents, do the alert management. All of that ties in back from an administrative standpoint because it's all integrated. And how does that integration work? So we have what's considered the data classification service behind the scenes. And the data classification service is what powers the identification of your sensitive data. So it's happening for you today, whether you know it or not. Right now, there is a collection of built-in sensitive information types into Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Purview that will say, I'm going to go identify all of the credit cards that are located in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. And that is occurring today. And what you can do is you can enhance that. So I can start to put in custom sensitive information or advanced classification, like exact data match, and inform the data classification service. And then the solutions inside of Purview. So our scanning solution for on-premises, our data map solutions in our schematized assets, inside our risk management, endpoint DLP, they're informed by this data classification service. So you can say, when I create an email and I put sensitive data into it, the classification service identifies it. And then if we have a DLP policy, we can put a control in based on that sensitive data. So it's all this big kind of circle of life based on the sensitive information types that you have. So think about what's important to you. There are 300 plus built-in sensitive information types inside of Microsoft. Most of the time we see organizations trying to identify their own, and we work with them to figure out what's important to you. Are there account information that's special? Is there customer IDs? Or what industry are you in that identifies a specific type of sensitive data? And then once you've identified it, we can do different things to work with it, right? So we can either manually identify it, so people can come in and do it. You can build what's called trainable classifiers. So let's say if you have a consistent type of document, maybe you have a contract file that they always look all the same, or maybe a statement of work, and we want to protect that. Well, you can actually use machine learning to go build models and actually identify what this train a classifier, and it can go out and find that sensitive data and add rules against it. Again, we have 300 plus Microsoft built in, and now we have what's called entities, which would be a combination of things together to say, like, this is PII, or this is credentials, I have a bundled credential. There's multiple types of credentials, but I'm going to define a credential, not just like, let's say, a username and password. And the last one, we have custom. So we can actually go out and build custom regex to identify anything in your organization, as far as deep as regex can go. Or we can do some exact data matching. We're actually working with an organization now that is kind of almost putting to the limits of how much data we can feed into EDM and the hundreds of millions of records in here to try to identify as that data moves in and out. So a lot of options to use this. Now, when you identify your sensitive data, you're going to start with the sensitive information types. You're then going to move into enabling MPIP, so information protection, either to manually classify or potentially move into the auto labeling. So we know the data. I want to classify the data. And when I've classified it, I then can build the DLP policies around it to say, I want to alert or block or prevent the data from moving. And then I want to monitor and report on that. So one of the things I've seen a lot as kind of a miss here in deploying Purview is that last bullet point here, which is monitoring and reporting, and this constant curation, that there are operational processes that you need to put in place in regards to your Purview deployment that will help you safeguard your data. So again, as data evolves, as we get more data, we need to monitor and understand how data is being classified, and see if we need to adjust classifications, adjust our sensitive information type, adjust our DLP policies. So it's really this tuning process that you want to make sure we have in place and attempt to automate some of those reviews, right? So how can we say, so in the example, in one organization, we're monitoring some data. We do a monthly review based on false positives to see, is there something we need to change in our the way we're identifying the sensitive data. But Purview gives us all of those options to do it, right? Purview gives us these core scenarios. Now, when I'm looking at the challenges that we kind of more specific user-based challenges versus organizational, we have kind of these two core roles, which is our security compliance admins and our users that are consuming this information. So our security and compliance admins need to know where that data is, how they can allow secure external collab, protecting exfil, and then also respond quickly. But you want to make sure we have the users happy, right? This is not simply a building a fort and saying people can't come in and out. That is not going to be good, because then your end users are going to try to find ways around it, and it might actually be a detriment to your business from a monetary or cost standpoint, that they're losing revenue because they can't communicate. So that's a challenging role for those compliance admins, to make sure they have happy users, and the end users, a lot of times they don't know, right? They don't care. And in some organizations, I've said the compliance admins, security admins, they don't trust the end users at all to identify these things. So the end users, it's a lot of, they want to get the work done. As a security admins, we want to ensure that they can get the work done, right? We need to understand that they are just working and they do not necessarily know what's sensitive. They do not know what type of project ID is specific for me. So think about, as you move into this deployment, you're safeguarding your data, that think about the end users. Think about what they need to do to safeguard their data. And it's not just putting those blocks in place. It's not just putting those classifications in and saying, I'm done. Understanding what is happening with those users. Do they even understand what those classifications are? It's a kind of core aspect as you're doing this. And to meet these, inside of Purview, we're looking at the ways we can locate sensitive data is through Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, and Content Search. If you really want to know, you can go into your environment today and you can do a content search and go find the sensitive data that exists in your SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Exchange environment today. Just go write a query and say, I want to go find social security numbers. I can also use Content Explorer to dive into the specific location of that today. So I can go in and open up Content Explorer if I have the right permissions and drill down into a SharePoint site or OneDrive to say, this has sensitive data. And as things are occurring, it's all tracked. So as that data becomes more sensitive or loses it, you actually have these rule match and rule undo, so they're all tracked in Activity Explorer. So you get to see all of these things that are happening to you on the security administrator side. And allowing external collaboration, think about more than email. So users are going to interact with email, Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive today. And how do we ensure that we're allowing external collaboration across all of these? How can we ensure security across all of these? And then we're protecting it. The ones I'm going to focus on right now is going to be DLP and IP. So data loss prevention and information protection. How do we very specifically safeguard that data in those locations and then respond to that? How can we go look at what's happening from an alert standpoint? So what that gives us, let's look at 3 different scenarios here. The first one is going to be blocking email. So let's kind of focus on email and email documents moving. So documents being shared externally. So a lot of organizations have DLP policies in email that when I create an email and I try to send a document, it scans that document and would block it based on specific rules. But how do we expand that into our SharePoint and OneDrive scenario, so I can be in OneDrive and share a file externally? So if I do share that file, I still have control of it, versus if I've shared that file through email and it does go through DLP and it bypasses it, or it doesn't, I shouldn't say bypass, but it goes through because it did not have a match, that file still technically left your organization. So it's actually more secure to be able to utilize some of the external sharing inside of M365 to protect your data from leaving. And now internally, how do we stop sensitive data inside of Teams? So how do we control the access to Teams or the data inside of chat? How do we control the movement of sensitive data inside of chat or inside of files in Teams, and honestly access to Teams as a whole, right? How do we know who can come in and out of Teams? I want to stop that sensitive data there. And on an endpoint side, we have endpoint capabilities to move data up and down, right? I want to upload a file onto Google Drive. I want to move a file onto a network share. I want to print this. I want to move it to a USB. These are all actually triggers that go back to other Purview solutions, but we can add data controls in here to stop that data from leaving your organization. So I'm going to jump into it now. I want to talk a little bit more about how this works. So I'm going to start with a content in my OneDrive. So this is your standard life cycle. I'm working in OneDrive. I want to create some content. I'm going to go out and I'm going to create a new Word document. So when I go create this new Word document, it's going to be creating this document in OneDrive. It's going to pre-create this content for me. Sorry, pre-create the document for me, and then I don't need to save it anymore, but I will say, this is a great file. And I'm going to call this SysKit for life. As I do this, it's going to be a file that there's nothing special about it. But what I want to highlight is over here inside of my browser, I have a sensitivity dropdown. This sensitivity dropdown gives me my collection of the different labels I've deployed to my organization, to my user. So my user has the ability to use Microsoft Purview information protection to go in and classify this content. So you could actually set these things by default. I could say everything by default is business use. I could set everything by default to confidential. I could enforce the user to require them to enforce a classification. And you'll see I also have the hierarchy. So if I go into, let's say, highly confidential, I have a personnel file, a legal file. These are all things that will help identify the sensitivity of that file itself. So I'm going to actually bring in some sample data over here. So this is not actually sensitive data. You grab this sensitive data, and I'm going to put this into this file. So as I put this content into this file, you can see it has some fake social security numbers, it has some fake credit card numbers. And what's happening is we actually have the idea that data is constantly being scanned in the environment. Right? So what I'm going to show you is I've added sensitive data to this environment. And within a few seconds, right, what's actually saying is my organization recommends that I change this classification to highly confidential personnel because identified personal information in this content. So I actually have the ability to recommend classifications. I can say, oh, that's actually a pretty good idea, but maybe I don't even want to do that. I don't believe you. I'm going to keep this and move it back to public. I think this should be shared publicly. So we recommended that classification to protect it. But now, and I say, well, that makes, I'm not sure that's really the best route. Am I actually protecting that content? So what's also going to be happening throughout this is this is still being protected by DLP. So as this content is here, it's actually still, even though I haven't provided that classification, it still has DLP controls around it to limit the sharing of this, content. So you'll see an example of what this looks like. As these files have been, they're not classified as highly confidential or anything, but if I pull this up, you're going to see a policy tip in here for this file called lots of SSNs that says this item contains the following social security numbers, or the following sensitive information. And access to this item is blocked. So if I went in and I tried to actually share this content, and I wanted to share lots of SSNs, you're going to see I don't have the option to do that. I'm actually completely restricted from sharing this content to only people who have access, which is technically just me, right? It's only blocked to me is the rule I put in play. If I go look at another file, let's look at just this test one file. I can show you my OneDrive here does have full access to share with anyone. I have full external access. I can share internally. I can share externally. I can put in a Gmail account in here. But once I've added DLP to this, now that I have DLP controls for this, it's actually going to be stopping me from sharing that specific information. And now you will see a little bit of a delay. There's a just-in-time access or sensitive by default. You'll see come in, but technically these files are protected to stop me from sharing these externally. And you'll see these little policy tips inside of OneDrive and SharePoint today. If you wanted to, we actually have the ability to override this content as well. So I have a different policy that says for credit card numbers, I actually need to be able to share those. But I only want to share them for specific people. So we actually have an override option that lets us empower the users, right? If I'm the user, I just want to get work done. So I can actually empower the users to report false positives and override potential actions that we want to allow them to continue to work securely. And then we can actually do auditing against those to make sure we know who was performing that action at specific points in time. And the same can be done through email, right? The most common one you're going to see is out in email. So I take the same information, I take this sensitive data right here, and I look at this policy tip. You're going to see as I put the sensitive data in, I get a policy tip for DLP, and I also get the sensitivity classification recommendation saying, hey, you have sensitive data in here. I want to move it to highly confidential. Okay, I could absolutely do that, right? So it's actually, it's built inside of the product. I don't need to go externally. I'm right in the browser here, and the same would be happening if I'm working on a client on my local workstation. So I would not actually be allowed to send this, right? It would actually, if I could look at this, I will not have the ability to send this data out. So I have DLP both on the file and on the email itself as I'm trying to move this content around. Now, what if I do just mark something as highly confidential? So I'm going to go into Teams and I'm going to look at some files in here, and you'll see I still in Teams, I still have that same DLP control that shows you my information in here. And I also have my sensitivity labels over here on the right, so I can see what files are marked as sensitive. And this is in a team that's called external Drew. And you see below it, I have a team called highly confidential Drew, and I'll come to that. But I'm an external Drew right now. So let's say if I go into external Drew and I want to share this collab with me file, I can actually share this file with anyone externally, right? So I can actually take this file, I could share this one with a anonymous access and this external Drew file. Now, that's great. And if I look at this team, I'm going to manage this team, and I want to show you this team also has guests, right? So this team, you'll see I actually have a guest in this environment. So I have an organization that's someone that's not part of this environment here, but I need to work with them securely, right? I need to work on external Drew securely. Now, what I'm also done is this team has a sensitivity label. So when I've created this team, I've applied a sensitivity label. I've deployed these labels, not just to files, but to the containers that they live in, to be able to safeguard the data that sits inside of these locations. So I have a team that's called, with a label that's called external. Now, if I come in externally, so I'm going to come in as Drew here. So here's another team set. I'm going to show you up here on the right. I'm logged in as Drew at Madelung.com, but I'm logged in the time of the organization. And you're going to see I'm remotely, or from a guest standpoint, I'm accessing the external Drew team. So I'm a guest coming into this team. Now you're going to see, if I pull these up side by side, one of the core things you're going to see is where's the file that's called some sensitive data, right? There's some sensitive data. If I go look over right on my guest, they can't see some sensitive data because we actually have built-in controls that don't allow external users to access data automatically once it's identified. So I can securely still collaborate, but I'm identifying sensitive data, one from a DLP standpoint, but hey, let's look a little bit deeper. So look at this file. So this super highly confidential file called it super HC. You're going to see this has this is super confidential. It has, I'm going to expand this out actually like this. You're going to see the sensitivity for this is going to be under the highly confidential. So this is actually marked as pull it back up again. This is marked as a highly confidential personnel file, okay? So I marked this as highly confidential personnel. I can still work with this file fine as Magneto, as my person here. Now, if I come in and try to pull up this file as my external user, or the guest coming in, you're gonna see I can't actually do this. So I actually have protection at 2 levels for safeguarding this data. I have protection at the classification level, so I can say external people can't get to personnel files. So if someone accidentally uploaded it to an external team, external people still can't get to it. And if I have DLP policies on that team, I also still won't allow that content to leave externally when people want to, if they accidentally or purposely put sensitive data inside of that team. Now, of course, I can still collaborate on content internally and externally with people inside of my organization or inside and out for non-sensitive content. So on this public file, I can work seamlessly, just like your regular co-authoring scenario, internally and externally, no stopping that. But I'm safeguarding the data based on what's in the data or what's classified with the data itself. And then the DLP controls are appended on top of that. And now what about protecting that, even going further, protecting that data inside of Teams, right? So I'm in Teams, I'm protecting the data moving in and out. I can also protect that data in chat. So here's me talking to that same external employee, so it's technically the guest here, but I can see down in here, I've put that same information in chat and I don't actually get that. So I'm actually blocking that information from a chat perspective, sending it externally to the externally. I can do this internally, I can do it externally, but I can identify it not just through the file movement, through email, but also through the chat as that data moves. And last one I want to show, as I pull this up, is what about the endpoint side? So I'm going to pull up this machine here, and I'm going to move this piece of content that's got it's got some passwords in it. So I'm going to attempt to move this content up to a shared location. What you're going to see is that I actually get a pop-up in here that says this is not accepted, right? You're not allowed to move that content. I didn't actually move that content up and over. So I'm able to protect the data as it moves here. And even if I want to go into the cloud, right, I could drag this piece of content up into the cloud here, and you're going to see I can't do that from a browser perspective either. I'm actually having these DLP blocks in place. So we're able to protect the data, and I could do that by classification. I could do it by the type of sensitive data that's into it. I could do it by the classification of the file. All of that comes back to say that's how you can really start to safeguard your data using Purview information protection and DLP. So that's kind of a lot, right? That's kind of a quick rundown through that. So how do you start? How do you know where to move to start to safeguarding your data? So where I've seen success in this is first, definition of understanding what you actually need to do, right? You say you need to know what data is important, what sensitive data it matters to you, or what legal obligations you have that you need to meet based on that data. Knowing that informs what type of controls you need to put in place. You then want to make sure you have an alignment with not just security. So what are the business units, or what are they actually doing? So work with them to figure out what sensitive data is for them. When we worked with the R&D group, it was very specific to their data points, and we worked with them specifically. Right? It's not just a generic security review for what needs to be protected from Purview. Now, moving down, understanding how Purview interacts with other applications. Now, it is good that I said like Purview is a solution that integrates a lot of solutions together, or a very integrated solution, but it's not common to see only Purview for safeguarding your data. So how does data classification interact with potentially another DLP solution or proxy solution that you have today, right? What are the other tools that we're using to safeguard our data, and how can we have Purview work together? Primarily, I see how can we have these DLP and information protection classifications work with our other applications, and then how are people working with that content? So really understanding Purview as its architecture, which is really what I'm trying to talk about here, and what does it do for other solutions. And as you go into this and you're deploying Purview solutions, it is change, right? It is business change for the users. So what do they need to know? What if they get an email saying, I've tried to send something externally? How do we know how to bypass it? Or how do we know that they can allow them to do it? And how do we know if they need to classify? Why is classification important? Don't underestimate org change when deploying Purview. So when you look at that, to have this, you want to have executive buy-in. And this is kind of across really any Microsoft deployment, but knowing that you have someone saying, especially for classification, we need to do classification because X. Like you need to have this executive push of this is a organizational change that we are deploying these rules, deploying these classifications, and this is why. And when you bring all those together, it really kind of sets the stage for understanding where that sensitive data is. And it's important because we see a lot of sensitive data moving and coming in and out. What Purview is from a whole, like why was the brand changed, into very specific safeguarding of that information. And this kind of hierarchy to get started will really start to lead you into how you can move into a more precise or more secure environment as part of Microsoft Purview. So with that, I'm going to go just to this one, but I do want to, this is kind of shifted back to we'll come back to Q&A here in a second, but I want to say, let's talk. I'm going to pass it back over to SysKit folks here.
Thank you, Drew, for that awesome presentation. I certainly learned a lot. So I will take a couple of minutes to talk about SysKit Point, our governance and security platform for M365 collaboration tools. And building on Drew's presentation, we'll focus on gaining insight into data and data security. So let's quickly dive into how Point can help you tackle some of those scenarios. So one of the quickest and easiest ways you could get a good bird's eye view of your tenant is to actually go onto the dashboard screen. So here you will see that we actually have a lot of things to explore, but we'll focus on the inventory of our resources and the different types of users that we have in the tenant. You can see that they're already grouped into some of the most commonly interesting groups, such as users with privileged access, those that have been blocked or are otherwise inactive, and external users. Now, external users are usually one of the most sensitive groups, especially if left unchecked. And therefore, we also have this external collaboration tile that will easily allow you to investigate them and the sites that have been shared externally. So while we can drill down on each of these tiles into more details, and you've probably noticed a few of the red flags that are trying to draw my attention, let's instead focus on the sites that I have in my tenant. So I don't have that many, but I would still like to reduce the scope a bit and let's say look at only the sites that are more sensitive. So to do that, I can actually enable a sensitivity label column and then filter those sites that are confidential. Now, this is already pretty manageable for me, but most production tenants will have a lot more data on here. So another good way to scope it down even further would be to enable and apply different custom metadata tags like department or project manager, priority, and or start date, and then filter that by that metric, and then you can get really specific about what you want to look at. So now that I have my focus area, let's quickly open this SharePoint site of the QA team. Now on the general info screen, I can see some useful information like who are the owners, what's the sharing policy, and of course my sensitivity label. I can very quickly explore the file and folder structure of that site, or I can check out the site level permissions that have been granted on the site. However, users more often than not are sharing files directly, therefore breaking permission inheritances, and none of that is visible on the top level. So for that, I would need to run a permission matrix report, which is a highly visual and structured report that will show me all of the permissions down to the file level and how they were granted. So by color coding, I can very easily identify if a user is an internal one or an external, if different types of groups have been used to grant access, if that access was granted directly or using any type of sharing link, and of course, which level of permission was granted. So let's imagine here that I've noticed a user that really shouldn't be there. And I can quickly click on it. And from there, I can explore all of the access that that particular user has. Now, it's a report similar to the permission matrix, but it focuses on one user's access across the entire tenant. From here, I can also see how that access was granted, and of course, I can remove that access immediately from there. So now that I've seen where that user has access, I also maybe want to check out what they have been doing with it. And for this, I can run the user activity report. This will allow me to see uh, all of the actions and the items that that user has been affecting. Now, it's worth noting that the speed at which I've been able to gather these reports is not mainly because this is a demo environment, but because this information is continually updated in point and collected. So when I run a report, instead of just querying the live tenant and waiting while being throttled, I'm running a query against point itself, and therefore it will always be much, much faster in comparison. The same is true for audit logs, which are not only accessed faster, but are retained much more than the default 90 days. So you can go up to a year in the past. So now that we have that, let's also think about a couple of more proactive ways to reduce risks moving forward. And I can perhaps do this by configuring a wide variety of alerts that will keep me up to speed on shared files or the external user activities that we've mentioned. But I can also assign different policies, for instance, access review, that will allow me to prompt my content owners to review their own data and keep everything nice and tidy without potentially oversharing things. Now, it's one thing to ask users to adhere to a certain policy or a security measure, but it's another to actually give them means to do so. And good news is that point can be also enabled for them. So everything I've shown you for here can be enabled for business users as well, which are painfully missing any type of admin interface to manage their own content. And in their case, the content would already be scoped only to what they have access to. And I believe that brings me to the end of my time. However, there is still a lot more to discover and explore with Point. So if you've noticed anything that piqued your interest or would like to try it out for yourself, don't hesitate to visit our website where you can sign up for a free demo, for a free trial, sorry. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. And Silvio, back to you.
Okay, can you hear me this time, Bruno?
Yeah, perfect
You
now.
can. Okay, great. I honestly believe the people in production actually cut my microphone because they don't like me talking too much. So, but okay, I'll talk to them after. So,
It could be.
yeah, thank you, Bruno. This was a great demo. Drew, thank you for the presentation. It was also great. I'm not sure if you managed to read my lips in between, but yeah, now is the time for the Q&A session. Everyone attending, so yeah, feel free to drop them over even during the Q&A session, and maybe someone else's question will motivate you to ask something. So yeah, Drew, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, just give me a second. Okay, so let's go with direct one. So does Microsoft Purview support scanning of zipped files?
It can. So the data classification itself will be able to, if I'm, let's say from a DLP perspective, pull the data out of the zip files themselves. So they're considered like archive files, and be able to detect that. Now there are, if you start to get into more some very specific encryption scenarios, there are some limitations when you're looking at decrypting some of those zips. So if they're looking at potentially password protected ones, there's levels of granularity depending on the use case. But at the highest level, if I have a file and I email it and I put it, you have a zip file or a RAR file, and I put some PII inside of that and upload it to SharePoint and try to send it out, it will look into that archive file as part of that data transfer, as part of that file sitting at rest. It could definitely get into all those archive files. What I would say, kind of to expand on that, kind of where something's coming as it relates to Purview, one of the big things I see is around OCR. So let's say you take a zip file and you put some TIFFs or some GIFs or some JPEG, like some type of thing that you want to OCR against it. It can't do that today, right? So if I have an image of sensitive data that is not textually bound, and then I put that in the zip and send it, that wouldn't be caught today. But it was actually posted out in the blog. Microsoft Secure was started yesterday. The ability for OCR coming into Purview and data inspection is coming soon. So it's further up on the road. It's that kind of more advanced data inspection is continuously expanding. So OCR is next on the list that could dive into the data inside those archive files.
Okay, great, thank you, Drew. Then, okay, let's do this one. So, can I have multiple Microsoft Purview accounts in the same subscription?
So Microsoft Purview is tied into your M365 tenant, right? So Purview as a solution, as a brand, is part of whichever domain or tenant you're logged into. So if I have Drew at drewmadelung.com as like my primary tenant, that I have Purview as part of that. Now, if you wanted, so you would always have kind of a single instance of the solution, a single instance of DLP, and it's all tenant boundaried. So if you wanted to have, let's say, protection on another tenant, you would want to you'd use the Purview controls in that tenant along with Purview controls in your tenants. And so it is a per tenant restriction or per tenant control. Now, there is a plethora of admin permissions inside of Purview. So Purview does have its own complete permission model that separates from Azure AD. So you want to have that, let's say, Content Explorer or some more of the information protection managers or administrators. Those are all very generic roles that when you deploy Purview, you want to file this privilege and you want to only grant access to those. But you do have a single entity for Purview inside of your organization. They just released something in the last few months called administrative units, which allows you to segregate your data a little bit more. So the question of like who can see specific sensitive data, who can reply to specific alerts, or if I'm in a conglomerate that has multiple organizations, you're still going to be in one Purview instance, but you really start to segregate it down after either at the user layer or the data layer inside of Purview itself.
Okay, great. Now on to another one, a bit different topic. So what are the licensing considerations for Purview?
So the best way to think about it is the majority of information is included from an E3 standpoint. So if you're looking at manual, like kind of, how should I say, automation is the trigger. So you have your standard SKUs of E1, E3, E5, or the 1 SKUs, 3 through 5 SKUs. The 3 SKU, which most organizations are in, would be manual. So if I wanted to manually classify content, or if I want to do some manual DLP, that is all included. If you want to go into automation, so if I want to go auto label content, if I want to, so that example of when I put sensitive data inside of that Word document or in that email, and then it classified it, that automatic identification, that's what triggers you into an E5 scenario. And you have this, it's very hard to limit to like only certain people in E5 versus not. So the key trigger is automation is E5, manual is E3, and then once you get inside of it, there's it's pretty much, yeah, I guess that's the biggest trigger. In E3 you can access all of that stuff, but you just can't do it to the level of you can with E5. So everyone gets Purview without knowing it, and then specific things like automation are added in when you upgrade that SKU.
Okay, thank you, Drew. I think we're gonna read just one more left for you, and then we're gonna kick one for Bruno, and then, well, you feel free to ask additional ones if you want to, that for attendees, of course. So if I'm already using Atlas, can I easily move to Microsoft Purview?
I wouldn't say easily. The way I look at kind of moving from any product like that is you have to understand the use case of what it's doing today. So I think of it from really the very specific technical controls that Atlas is doing, and can it mirror it? Kind of. Like it's just different in the way that it's set up. So it's not a one-to-one. It's when you're looking at moving things into Purview, it's a very, Atlas or others, right? I think a core one can be semantic or CrowdStrike, let's say. Like what am I going to be doing? What are the specific actions that are occurring there? What are the very specific policies that are set up inside of that? And then do they actually mirror, right? So if they don't, then what can it do to that level? And is it feasible? Is it worth it? I will say when doing the move from Purview from other applications, I see less of a concern with like the actionable things that are occurring. It's the reporting, the operations that are occurring outside of it. So let's say one organization I'm working with is on Semantic today, and I mean they have the amount of Semantic policies and the way that the operations team views those policies, and mitigates them, and runs reports on them. Like changing that culture and being like, well, now you need to go into this portal to go do this here, and it's not the same. Like even if you mirrored the tech exactly, it's the kind of the change management both from the administrative staff and the end user side of how it impacts them. So it's kind of consistent with whichever product you go from. I tend to concentrate more on that versus saying policy based. But in general, there is never it is not a quick shift for any move over into Purview. Crawl, walk, run. That's where I go. Almost everything inside of this is crawl, walk, and then run, and don't overdo everything. So if you want to start bringing certain services one at a time, crawl there, walk to, let's say we want to have a few more, and then automate, and then let's say run is we start to deprecate the other solution.
Okay, great. Thank you, Drew, for well extensive answers to the questions. And I think I'm gonna do the last one, which is actually related to the one for the point demo. So Bruno has some work to do here as well. So the question is, what types of guest users can I see with point?
Oh yeah, so all types of guest users are recognized in point, both ad hoc users or your standard guest account that have been, added to your own tenant as normal guest account.
And that's super. As someone an external, like even understanding what ad hoc is, like people miss like, oh, I run a report and I see what's shared. It's like, well, actually, did you actually get what's shared? Because there's multiple kinds of sharing inside of 365. So that one is needed to understand. Like understanding the difference between those is good, and it needs both.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so I think we can slowly wrap it up here. Thank everyone for joining us for our today's webinar. So as mentioned, everyone will receive, everyone who registered obviously will receive a recording of the webinar. Thank you again, Drew, for the presentation, for answering the questions, for joining us today. It was, well, a pleasure having you here. Hope to see you again. Is there anything else you'd like to add on this topic or generally before we say goodbye to everyone?
Yeah, I just want to read, like, I think I'm just going to close with a crawl, rock, run. I think when you're looking at safeguarding your data, a big takeaway is some protection is better than none. Like whether you turn on a DLP report, just in report only mode, turn on a basic DLP report, do classification, but only do classification only. Like don't get stuck thinking that you can get to the end quickly, but smaller iterations of deployment of Purview is better than no iteration of deployment for Purview. And I have too many people saying this doesn't do enough. It's like, well, that's something is better than nothing. And I think that is when you're safeguarding it, think about just getting started and then having a cadence to keep that moving forward.
Okay, so yeah, once again, goodbye from me. If you have any further questions regarding SysKit Point, any of our products, feel free to reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. And yeah, it was a pleasure having you all here. Hope to see you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.